So Canada just humiliated the United States of America on the world stage. Not China, not Russia, Canada. The country Americans make jokes about the polite neighbor with a maple syrup and the hockey teams. That Canada just handed Washington the most embarrassing trade defeat in modern American history. And it wasn't even close. Trump threatened the biggest trade war in North American history, promised it would bring Canada to its knees in a matter of days, and it just blew up in his face spectacularly. And within hours, Warren Buffett broke his legendary silence with a statement that Wall Street is calling the most brutal economic autopsy of a trade policy ever delivered by a living investor. When you see the numbers, how many billions in American wealth just evaporated? How many US industries are now scrambling to survive? And what Canada is doing with the leverage Trump accidentally handed them? You'll understand why economists across the political spectrum are saying this isn't just a policy mistake. This is the most catastrophic miscalculation in modern American trade history. And the most humiliating part, Canada saw it coming. They were ready. They have been ready for over a year. Hit subscribe right now because what I'm about to walk you through is going to change how you think about everything. Let me take you back to where this started. 3 weeks ago, Trump stood in the Rose Garden on a Tuesday afternoon, flanked by his trade advisors, his commerce secretary, and a row of American flags. So perfectly arranged, they looked like a movie set. The press pool was packed, the cameras were rolling, and Trump announced the most aggressive tariff package ever directed at a single allied nation in modern American history. 25% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, 20% on lumber, the raw material that builds American homes, 15% on dairy, agricultural products, and auto parts. A 10% blanket tariff on all remaining Canadian imports that didn't fall into a specific category. The total value of goods affected over $400 billion in annual bilateral trade, making this the largest tariff action against a single country since the Smooth-Hawley Act of End. Trump's language was vintage. Trump casual, dismissive, dripping with the confidence of a man who believes the outcome is already decided before the fight has even started. Canada's been ripping us off for decades, he said, leaning into the microphone with that familiar half-squint. They send their lumber down here. They send their oil. They take our money, and they laugh all the way to the bank. That's over. Starting today, that is over. He pointed at the cameras. They need us far more than we need them. This will be over in a week, maybe 2. They'll come to the table. They'll make a deal, and it'll be a great deal for us. He smiled. His advisor smiled. The Commerce Secretary nodded. The message was unmistakable. This was a negotiation between a giant and an ant, and the ant was about to get stepped on. Behind the scenes, the confidence was even more absolute. According to 3 officials who were present in the Oval Office briefings leading up to the announcement, Trump's trade team had modeled what they called a capitulation timeline. They predicted Canada would resist publicly for 72 hours, maybe a week at most, before the economic pressure became unbearable, and Ottawa came crawling back to negotiate on American terms. One senior advisor reportedly told colleagues, "This is the easiest win we'll ever have. Canada has no cards to play." And on paper, the math supported that confidence. The United States economy is roughly 10 times the size of Canada's. Canada sends approximately 75% of its total exports to the United States. Canadian manufacturers, farmers, and energy producers depend on American demand the way a body depends on oxygen. Cut that off. And the theory was simple. Canada suffocates, Canada panics, Canada folds, Canada signs. Whatever deal Trump puts in front of them. This wasn't just Trump's assumption. It was nearly universal. Economic analysts on both sides of the border said the same thing. Betting markets gave Canada virtually zero chance of winning a sustained trade conflict with the United States. The editorial boards, the think tanks, the cable news panels, everyone agreed Canada had no leverage. Canada had no options. Canada would do what Canada always does: negotiate quietly, compromise politely, and accept whatever terms the bigger partner dictates. But this wasn't just about trade policy. If you look closely, you could see the personal dimension. Trump and Canadian leadership had been on a collision course for months. There was the NATO spending dispute, where Canada's defense budget fell short of the 2% GDP target Trump demanded. There was the border security disagreement, where Ottawa pushed back on Trump's characterization of the northern border as a crisis zone. And there was the G7 summit incident, where Canadian officials publicly contradicted Trump's claims about trade deficits, prompting Trump to call Canadian leadership dishonest and weak on social media. This wasn't just trade policy. This was personal. Trump wanted Canada to bend, and he wanted the world to watch it happen. But what Trump didn't know, what nobody in Washington seemed to realize, was that Canada had been preparing for this exact moment for over a year. And their preparation was about to turn the most powerful economy on earth into a case study and how not to start a trade war. Canada didn't panic. Canada didn't beg. Canada punched back. Within 72 hours of Trump's Rose Garden announcement, Ottawa unveiled a retaliatory tariff package that was so precisely targeted, so surgically constructed, that trade analysts on 3 continents called it the most strategically sophisticated retaliation in modern trade history. Canada didn't just slap random tariffs on American goods the way most countries do in trade disputes. They did something far more intelligent, far more calculated, and far more devastating. They targeted products from the most politically sensitive states in America, the exact states Trump needed to win re-election. 25% tariffs on Kentucky bourbon. That's Mitch McConnell's backyard. The state that produces 95% of the world's bourbon supply and where the whiskey industry supports over 20,000 jobs. 20% on Wisconsin dairy products. A direct hit to one of the most contested swing states in the country. A state Trump won by fewer than 23,000 votes. 30% on Pennsylvania steel, the state that delivered Trump the presidency in 2016, by a margin so thin you could measure it with a ruler, and that he absolutely cannot afford to lose. 20% on Iowa and Nebraska agricultural exports, corn, soybeans, pork, the heartland. Trump's core base, the farmers who wore the red hats and believed him when he said trade wars are good and easy to win. Canada also targeted Florida orange juice, Tennessee whiskey, North Carolina furniture, and Ohio manufacturing components. Every single product was chosen not for its economic significance to Canada, but for its political significance to the Republican Party. Every single tariff was designed to cause maximum political pain in the places where Trump was most vulnerable. This wasn't an economic response. This was a political operation executed with military precision. Canada had clearly warramed this for months, probably longer. They had studied American electoral maps the way a general studies a battlefield, identified the pressure points, calculated the economic impact per congressional district, and built a retaliatory package that didn't just hurt the American economy in the abstract. It hurt specific American politicians in specific American towns, where specific American voters were about to feel the pain in their wallets. And here's where you need to pay attention. Because the retaliatory tariffs were devastating, but they weren't even Canada's most powerful weapon. That came next, and it's the part most Americans still don't know about. Canada supplies approximately 60% of all crude oil imported by the United States. Let me say that again, because this is the number that changes everything about the story. 60%, not 10, not 2060. Canada also supplies roughly half of America's natural gas imports. The pipelines that carry Canadian energy into the United States, Keystone Enbridge Line 5, the Trans-Canada Mainline network, are not optional infrastructure. They are the arteries that keep American refineries running, American homes heated through the winter, American factories powered, and American gas stations supplied from Michigan to Montana. When Ottawa signaled through diplomatic channels that it was prepared to impose export levies on energy shipments to the United States, not a cutoff, not an embargo, just a carefully calibrated tax that would raise the cost of every single barrel of Canadian crude entering American refineries by 8 to 12. The entire dynamic of the trade war shifted in an instant. It was like watching a chess game where one player suddenly reveals they've had a queen hidden behind a pawn the entire time. Oil futures spiked within hours. The price of West Texas. Intermediate crude jumped over 6% in a single trading session. The largest single-day move not caused by a war or natural disaster in over 3 years. American refineries in the Midwest, particularly in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, which are physically engineered to process heavy Canadian crude, and which cannot simply switch to lighter Middle Eastern or domestic alternatives without billions of dollars in infrastructure modifications and years of construction, sent ear letters to the White House warning of potential fuel shortages and refinery shutdowns within weeks if the situation escalated. You can survive without Canadian lumber. Your housing costs go up, but you survive. You can survive without Canadian aluminum. Your beer cans cost a few cents more, but you manage. You can survive without Canadian dairy. You find another source of cheese. You cannot, and I want to be very clear about this, you cannot survive without Canadian energy. Not quickly, not cheaply, not without economic pain that would make the tariffs look like a rounding error. And everyone in Ottawa knew it. They'd known it for years. They built their entire retaliation strategy around it. They just never had a reason to say it out loud until Trump gave them one. Think about that for a moment. Trump assumed Canada had no options. He said it publicly. His advisors modeled a capitulation timeline. And the whole time, Canada had been sitting on the single most powerful economic leverage point in the entire bilateral relationship, America's energy dependence. And they played it at the exact moment it would cause maximum impact. Trump saw a punching bag. Canada saw a chessboard. But Canada didn't stop there. They'd spent the previous year quietly, methodically, almost invisibly building something even more important than retaliatory tariffs and escape route. While Trump was tweeting about trade deficits at 2 in the morning and holding rallies where he promised easy victories, Canadian trade officials were on planes to Brussels, Tokyo, London, Canberra, and New Delhi. They deepened Canada's commitment to CEDA, the comprehensive trade agreement with the European Union that gives Canadian exporters preferential access to a market of 450 million consumers. They expanded participation in the CPTP, the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership that the United States walked away from under Trump, and that now covers 11 nations and over 500 million consumers across Asia and the Pacific. They negotiated a new bilateral trade agreement with the United Kingdom, securing market access for Canadian agricultural products that had previously gone almost exclusively to the United States. And they opened exploratory trade talks with India, South Korea, and several Southeast Asian nations, laying the groundwork for partnerships that would take years to mature. But that signal to the world, Canada is open for business, and it doesn't need permission from Washington. Canada didn't just respond to Trump's threats. They had already built the escape route before he even made them. By the time the tariffs hit, Canada had pre-negotiated alternative buyers for its lumber, its wheat, its canola, its manufactured goods. Canadian lumber companies had already signed preliminary contracts with European construction firms. Canadian farmers had already locked in export agreements with Japanese and South Korean distributors. The pain of losing American market access would be real. Nobody pretended otherwise. But it wouldn't be fatal because Canada had spent a year making sure that the United States was no longer its only option. And that single, strategic decision, the decision to diversify before the crisis, not during it, is what ultimately won the trade war before it even started. Trump brought a sledgehammer. Canada brought a scalpel, and the scalpel won. And then Warren Buffett stepped to the microphone, and the last delusion that Trump's trade war was anything other than a catastrophe was shattered on live television. Buffett was at a Berkshire Hathaway shareholders event in Omaha when a CNBC reporter asked him about the trade situation with Canada. The 94-year-old billionaire paused, removed his glasses, cleaned them slowly with his tie the way he always does when he's about to say something he wants every person in the room to carry with them for the rest of their lives, and then delivered a response that financial networks replayed on a loop for the rest of the VOC. Trade wars are sold as strength, Buffett said, his voice steady and deliberate. They're actually confessions of weakness. A country that has to threaten its neighbors to get a good deal is a country that can't compete on its own merits. And a leader who thinks tariffs are paid by the other country has failed economics at the most basic level imaginable. The room went still, not quiet. Still the kind of silence that happens when everyone in a room simultaneously realizes they're witnessing something historic. Buffett continued, "Tariffs are not paid by Canada. I want to be very clear about this because there seems to be profound confusion in Washington. Tariffs are paid by American importers, American manufacturers, and American consumers. Every dollar of these tariffs comes out of American pockets. This is not a theory. This is not a partisan opinion. This is arithmetic. And apparently arithmetic is no longer a requirement for setting trade policy in the United States of America." He paused, took a sip of his cherry Coke, and kept going. "You know, I've been investing for 70 years. I've seen a lot of bad policy. I've seen governments make mistakes. That's normal. What I've never seen is a government deliberately make its own products more expensive, alienate its own trading partners, destabilize its own supply chains, and then call it a victory. That's not bad policy. That's economic self-harm." Then Buffett revealed something that sent a chill through every trading desk on Wall Street. Berkshire Hathaway had already begun repositioning its portfolio. "We've shifted capital away from sectors with significant cross-border exposure," he said. "Matter-of-factly, when government policy becomes this erratic, this divorced from economic reality, capital doesn't fight, doesn't argue, it doesn't write letters to Congress. It leaves. It finds somewhere more rational to go. And right now, rational is not the word I would use to describe American trade policy." Then Buffett said something that completed the humiliation. He was asked directly about Canada's response, and his answer landed like a verdict, delivered from the bench of the highest court in finance. Canada played this perfectly. He said they were patient, they were strategic, and they understood something that apparently escaped the entire White House trade team. That in economics, the person who needs the deal less always wins. Canada spent a year making sure they needed this deal less. That's not luck. That's preparation. That's competence. And it stands in rather stark contrast to what we've seen from Washington. Money doesn't have a flag. It goes where it's treated well. And right now, according to the most successful investor in the history of American capitalism, it's leaving the United States. If your trade policy makes Warren Buffett move his money, your trade policy has already failed. That's not a political statement. That's a financial autopsy. But the tariffs were only the beginning of the damage. What happened next in American markets, in American factory towns, and in American kitchens is something Trump's team apparently never bothered to model. Within the first 2 weeks, the cascading damage became impossible to ignore, impossible to spin, and impossible to blame on anyone but the policy itself. Lumber prices spiked 22%, adding an estimated $14,000 to the cost of building a new American home in a housing market that was already unaffordable for millions of young families. Gas prices in the Midwest rose 31 cents per gallon in 10 days, with energy analysts projecting further increases of up to 70 cents per gallon as the Canadian export levies took hold through the winter. Aluminum costs hit a 3-year high, driving up prices on everything from beverage cans to aircraft components to the wiring and new construction. Auto parts crossing the border. And there are billions of dollars worth of auto parts that cross the US-Canada border multiple times during the assembly of a single vehicle, suddenly carried a 20% surcharge that was immediately passed on to American car buyers. The average price of a new car sold in America increased by over $2,000 in a single month. The average American household, according to estimates from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, is now paying between $1,800 and $2,400 more per year as a direct result of these tariffs. Not Canadian households, American households. Trump didn't start a trade war with Canada. He started a trade war with American consumers, and American consumers are losing. The industries hit hardest started turning on the policy almost immediately, and the revolt wasn't quiet. Ford issued a public statement warning the tariffs on Canadian auto parts would force price increases across its entire North American lineup, and that the company was reviewing production timelines at 4 plants. General Motors announced a hiring freeze at 3 Michigan facilities and delayed the launch of 2 new models. The National Association of Home Builders called the lumber tariffs a direct tax on the American dream of home ownership and projected that the tariffs alone would price over 300,000 families out of the housing market the next year. The American Farm Bureau Federation, an organization that endorsed Trump in 2 consecutive presidential elections, and that represents the rural voters who were the backbone of his political coalition, released data showing that retaliatory Canadian tariffs had already cost American agricultural exporters over $2 billion in lost contracts in just the first 3 weeks, with farmers in Iowa, Wisconsin, Nebraska, and the Dakotas absorbing the worst of it. A soybean farmer in Iowa named Dale Reinhardt went viral on social media when he posted a video from his tractor holding up a stack of cancelled purchase orders from Canadian buyers. "I voted for the man," Reinhardt said, his voice shaking. I believed him when he said this would help us. These tariffs aren't helping me. They're killing me. His own base is being destroyed by his own policy. The farmers who wore the red hats, who showed up to the rallies, who believed him when he said trade wars are good and easy to win. Those are the people paying the highest price. And they know it. We've been here before, by the way. In 1930, the United States passed the Smooth-Hawley Tariff Act, imposing massive tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods in an attempt to protect American industry during the early stages of the Great Depression. The result was catastrophic. America's trading partners retaliated. Global trade collapsed by 65% within 4 years. Economists across the political spectrum then and now consider Smoot-Hawley one of the single worst pieces of economic legislation in American history, a law that didn't protect American workers, but instead deepened and prolonged the worst economic crisis the country had ever faced. That's the historical precedent for what Trump just did. And, apparently nobody in his trade team bothered to look it up. And it gets worse because the damage isn't just economic, it's strategic, and it's potentially permanent. America's closest allies are watching what happened to Canada, and they are drawing the obvious, devastating conclusion. If the United States will do this to Canada, its closest ally, its largest trading partner, its partner in NATO and NORAD in Five Eyes intelligence sharing, the nation with which it shares the longest undefended border in human history, and with which it has maintained peaceful relations for over 2 centuries, then no alliance is safe. No trade agreement can be trusted. No American handshake means what it used to mean. The European Union accelerated negotiations on trade, diversification measures within days of the Canadian tariffs. EU Trade Commissioner Valdos Dioscus issued a statement that stopped just short of calling the United States an unreliable partner, using the diplomatic euphemism. We must prepare for a trading environment in which traditional assumptions about transatlantic cooperation may no longer hold. In Brussels, that's the equivalent of screaming. Japan quietly initiated contingency planning for potential US tariff actions against Japanese auto exports with Toyota and Honda, both reportedly developing supply chain scenarios that reduce North American dependence. Australia, South Korea, and the United Kingdom all signaled through diplomatic backchannels that they were reassessing the reliability of American trade commitments going forward. New trade agreements are being signed and expanded around the world at a pace not seen since the aftermath of World War II. The CPTP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the massive trade bloc that Trump pulled the United States out of in his first term, is actively expanding with the United Kingdom, already a member in several new nations in advanced secession talks. CA, the EU-Canada trade deal, is being deepened with new provisions that explicitly create preferential market access for Canadian goods that used to go to the United States. The EU-Mercosur agreement is being fast-tracked after years of delay. And the one thing all of these agreements have in common, the single thread that connects every deal being signed on every continent, is that the United States of America is not at the table. Trade agreements take decades to build and moments to destroy. What Trump dismantled in a single Rose Garden press conference, the trust, the reliability, the assumption that the United States would honor its commitments, will take a generation to rebuild. And that's the optimistic scenario. The pessimistic scenario is that it can't be rebuilt at all, because the world has already moved on. And here's the part that should terrify every American, regardless of which party they vote for, regardless of how they feel about Donald Trump personally. While Trump was busy attacking Canada, China was watching and smiling and taking notes. Beijing has spent the better part of 2 decades trying to position itself as a reliable alternative to American economic partnership. They've invested trillions in the Belt and Road Initiative, offering infrastructure loans and trade deals to nations across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and increasingly Eastern Europe. The pitch has always been simple. America is unreliable. America changes its mind every 4 years. America uses trade as a weapon against its own friends. We don't. We build roads, we build ports, we build partnerships, and we don't tear them up because of an election. For years, that pitch had limited success because most countries still preferred the stability, the transparency, and the rule of law embedded in the American-led economic order. Dealing with America was predictable. Dealing with America was safe. Trump just proved Beijing's pitch right in attacking Canada. Not China, not a strategic rival, but America's closest and most loyal ally. Trump handed China the single most powerful piece of evidence it has ever had for its argument that the United States cannot be trusted as a long-term economic partner. Countries that were on the fence about deepening ties with Beijing are now actively accelerating those conversations.